A couple of quick practical points. Duncan has a camera there, phone camera. It's only pointing over here. So we're recording these talks. We put the talks from the previous series online, and that's been great for activists in whatever part of the world, or people in any part of the world who want to look at them. So we're just recording. And I mean, if it comes to asking a question and you particularly don't want it to be recorded, just tell us at that moment. But as for the visual images, they're only going to be of people up here. So just a couple of words about the series, because we've had new people at each talk, and today I can see is no exception. The series is being held this year, 50 years since the dramatic year of 1968, and the series is called The Social Histories of Revolution, the Long 1960s, and so we're looking not just at that year of 1968, but that whole period, starting in the early 60s and going right up to the event that we're going to talk about this evening, the Iranian Revolution of 1979. So we're looking at that whole period of tumultuous social change. The 1968 general strike in France has been the subject of one of the meetings, the social movements that swept the US and Europe, but also revolts through the Middle East, Latin America, other parts of the global south, and movements in the so-called socialist countries. Movements that brought feminism to the fore, and all sorts of new aspects to social struggles. And we've had a number of talks already, and the talks carry on through the year. And they follow on a very successful series of talks that we had in last year on the social histories of the Russian Revolution. We timed that obviously for the centenary of the 1917 revolution. So the sessions are opened by historians who've studied these movements, or by people who participated in them in the case of the 1960s and 70s. And we usually start with an opening talk of about 30 minutes. And then there's discussion. These are not academic seminars in the usual sense, and we encourage attendance and participation by everyone. And when we come to the question period, if you haven't been to this sort of thing before and you're sitting there wondering whether to ask a question, and is everybody going to think I'm stupid if I ask, just go ahead and ask, because we won't think that, and we want to encourage participation by people who are perhaps new to these conversations. The emphasis in the meetings is on the social histories of these movements and of revolutionary changes. That is, how they were experienced by the mass of working people who took part in them. That's been the theme running through both of these series. The idea is to reach a deeper understanding of revolution as the active participation of millions of people in changing history, and we hope our discussions will provoke us all to think a bit more about what is a revolution and how does it change the world. Does it change the world? The session tonight is on revolution and counter-revolution in Iran. We're going to try out a slightly different format, where we'll start off with a series of questions from me as a kind of interview, and then but we'll then follow that with questions and discussion from the audience. So very pleased to have here with us Torab Saleth. He's a writer and political activist. He's a member of the Revolutionary Socialist Tendency of Iran, and he participated in the Iranian Revolution between 1979 and 1981, and left the country during the wave of political repression that followed. From 1979 to 1985, Torab was National Secretary of the Socialist Workers' Party of Iran. That was part of a Trotskyist international organisation, the United Secretariat of the Fourth International. And he resigned from that in response to the continued cooperation of that group with another group which had collaborated with the Islamic regime. He's recently written in Persian a history of communist organizations in Iran in the 1960s and 1970s. So we're really pleased to have him here to talk with us. We'll start. So I'm going to sit around this way, as I say, I'm going to start with some questions for Torab, and then we'll bring in questions from all of you. So starting first, actually chronologically, the revolution that overthrew the regime of the Shah in 1979 did not spring out of nowhere. There was a big workers' movement, including strikes and protests, that built up for 2 or 3 years before that. So could you start by describing that movement that led up to 1979? Who participated? What was that movement aiming at? What was the pre-history of the revolution?
Yes, first of all, hello, greetings, comrades and friends. Thank you for inviting me. I hope we have a good discussion. It's an interesting question. Indeed, how do you judge the signs of an impending revolutionary crisis? Even with hindsight, it is not that easy if you think about it. What do you call this is the turning point? This is coming, the revolutionary crisis is coming. We were grappling with that question, actually, before the revolution as a political group, because events were moving very rapidly over the last 3-4 years before the regime was overthrown. So we were constantly confronted with this question. I myself, when I say I, our group, at the time actually said the movement of the urban poor is a sign of the impending social crisis. And I think we were proven to be right. Because urban poor was a phenomenon which developed in Iran during the 1970s after the crisis of the Shah's White Revolution. The Shah's White Revolution, which involved huge industrialization, had resulted in a number of shanty towns around all major cities in Iran, totaling to almost, the rough estimates, but 5 to 6 million people. In Tehran alone, there were about 700,000 of them. And they were referred to by the authorities as out-of-bounds people, meaning out of boundaries of the city limits. The city authorities refused services to these communities, saying you're out of bounds, you're out of the boundary of the city. So they became famous as out of bounds, translation from the Persian. There were signs of protest among these shanty towns right from end of 75, early 76. The economic crisis of the Shah began in 75. And this led to huge, riots in Tehran, which was actually crushed by the army. Even the police could not handle it, and they had to bring in the army to crush the revolt of the Tehran's urban poor. We said, that's it. That's the sign of the social crisis, because we had predicted that this type of capitalist growth that was undertaken by the Shah would result in such a situation, would result in a number of, these shanty towns, because the growth in the industries could not absorb the migration from the countryside. Simple, arithmetic showed that we would have a huge problem in Iranian society soon, and it happened. But anyway, then it went quiet. Nothing happened almost for after this crush of these, first riots in Tehran. Things went quiet for a while. I mean, not quiet, but normal type of tempo of, struggles, the usual things. Nothing extraordinary. There were also few strikes, few workers' strike after this. But again, they were more or less, except one of them, sort of crushed. It went quiet. It went quiet until, say, Carter became president, basically. After Carter became president, if you all remember, he made a big deal about defense of human rights and democracy. They were focusing on Soviet Union then. This was a sort of pressure on Soviet Union at the time. But a number of bourgeois politicians in Iran took that as a sign that we can now protest against the Shah. So a number of statements, circulars began to appear of various bourgeois currents and parties and individuals, sort of analyzing the crisis or offering solutions, etc. And again, another sign appeared, which was a sign of weakness of the regime. The regime did not react to most of these, did not suppress them. Usually you would go and arrest all, any individual that signed these things and put them in jail. No, a lot of these got away, all these statements. Then there was another very significant thing that happened. The Writers' Association, which is a sort of association of Iranian writers always opposed to the Shah, mostly. And it's quite well known. It was well known in those days. Called for 10 nights of poetry readings at the Goethe Institute in Tehran. Iranians have a thing with poetry, so these poetry readings became ever so successful. There were tens of thousands of people attending every night. And it became a huge political event. I mean, that in itself showed something is happening. The Iranian society is undergoing huge changes. So there was lots of this type of, signs that you could see. There was the level was rising inside the student movement, which had always been the sort of at the forefront of a struggle since the coup in 1953. So there were signs there were a few more strikes, but again, nothing that significant. It was mostly at a sort of bourgeois political level, the activities and the statements and the discussions was searching for alternatives to the Shah, basically, at the top. Until, in January 1978, yes, January 1978, no, sorry, I forgot to add another point. In 77, when these poetry readings took place, immediately after, the son of Khomeini died, under, at the time, suspicious circumstances in Najaf, where Khomeini was in exile. Now it turns out he died naturally. There was nothing suspicious about it. But at the time, of course, it was blamed on Savak, blamed on the Iranian regime, and that itself led to quite a number of meetings in various universities, cities,
Just explain to some of the younger people here what is Savak and who was Khomeini.
Khomeini was a sort of one of the religious leaders who emerged in the 1960s as a leader of opposition to the Shah because he opposed the White Revolution. He was one of the mullahs, one of the religious leaders who came out openly against the Shah's White Revolution, calling it American, conspiracy, calling the Shah an Israeli agent, and there was a huge movement of protest which was crushed in 1964-65. Then we had, the White Revolution carried on. They forced him into exile, and he was in exile until 1979. He was in Najaf, which is the main center of Shiite, hierarchy in Iraq. So he was living there. Few months before the revolution, he was brought to Paris, and he was sort of presented or made into the leader of the Iranian opposition to the Shah. And if you go into the history of it and the documents that have emerged, it seems there was actually sort of machinations by the imperialists, certain sections of the Sabak itself. Sabak is the Iranian intelligence service during the Shah, which was, the main instrument of repression during the whole period after 1953 coup until the revolution. So there was some, negotiations to actually bring him and, present him as the leader. There was some tendencies at the time pushing him to the forefront. Anyway, this is Khomeini. And Khomeini was not a major, figure in the Shia hierarchy. He became more so politically rather than because of his sort of theological standing. There were Ayatollahs a lot more senior than him. But he became leader of the whole Shia hierarchy because of his opposition to the Shah. Because he was the one who kept on saying, no, the Shah must go, the Shah must go, the Shah must go. And eventually he proved to be right. So everybody sort of followed him, basically. By the time the Shah went, he had complete domination of the Shiite hierarchy. Anyway, during the October 1977, religious opposition emerged as trying to organize itself. As I said, first it was the death of Shariati, one of the sort of religious political figures in Iran, which even the Shia hierarchy accused him of mixing Marxism and Islam. He's a sort of liberation theology type of guy, that you have a lot in Latin America, but he's a sort of Islamic version of it. Mujahideen at the time supported him a lot. He died under suspicious circumstances in London, in UK, and then son of Khomeini, Mustafa, died in Najaf. So these two events led to a lot of meetings and organization and little demos here, little protests there, all trying to commemorate Mustafa Khomeini and Shariati, nothing so very innocent looking type of. But it suddenly showed a huge network of these religious groups emerging everywhere. In most universities, we had never heard of them before. We had never heard of them before. But they all suddenly came together and emerged. This led in and this is a major turning point. In January 78, suddenly a mysterious statement appeared in the national press, apparently from the government. Nobody knows who it came from, most likely from Sabak itself, from the security services itself, accusing Khomeini of being an English agent and trying to, sort of has made a coalition with the communists, meaning the Tudeh party, pro-Soviet, Iranian version of the Communist Party, and they are trying to sort of, basically sell Iran to Soviet Union. So the title was the Red and Black Reaction. So this is and very insulting to Khomeini in particular. Of course, there were protests against these seminaries in Qom, which is a religious city where most of the theological schools were at the time. The seminaries there went on a demonstration, which was crushed by the army, and a couple of guys got killed. So after this, the religious hierarchy called for this so famous 40 days mourning cycle. This is a sort of Islamic tradition that you respect the dead after 40 days by holding some, ceremony, some event. So on the 40 days of the death in Rome, there were demonstrations in almost 20, 30 cities in Iran, protesting the events in Rome. In Tabriz, which is a city in northwest Iran, it erupted into a whole clash with the army, which lasted the whole day. basically the protesters took over the city almost for a whole day. And eventually it was crushed, but this was the most significant sign yet. So all of us then, sort of publicly, we also, oh, that's the turning point. Tabriz, so we call Tabriz the turning point. Because, I mean, in fact, I remember myself very well. We actually, this was the headline of, paper at the time, that this is, revolution is coming. This is it.
Now, what you've talked about so far, somebody listening to you talking could think, there's the urban poor, there's the religious hierarchy against the regime. But what I remember looking from the outside at that time is that at the end of 1978, you have an oil workers' strike, which obviously has a huge international impact. So how do you get from Tabriz to that?
I was just leading into this, But it is important to have that background. Otherwise, you don't get the sort of regroupments that takes place later on. So this is by now, 78. We have these cycles, 40-day cycles. Religious hierarchy has taken over basically the opposition. All demonstrations that the regime cannot suppress is sort of arranged beforehand by some level of permission from the police, from the SAVAK to hold this. By now they are so powerful they can actually do this with the authorities. It's all organized by the religious hierarchy. The left, even when you wanted to participate in this protest, had to participate under the domination of the religious hierarchy. For example, women comrades would put a hijab on before going to these demonstrations, otherwise they wouldn't be allowed. So they were already dominating. But you have to bear in mind, by now the atmosphere in Iran has totally changed. So suddenly we see in 78, alongside these religious demonstrations, basically you can say 3 waves of workers' strikes. The first one is almost 20, 30, units which go on a strike. After a month or so, almost all of them succeed. The regime is in a weak position, so concedes most of the demand. They go back 2 months later, another wave of 70, 80 strikes develops. Sometimes some of the workers who had gone on strike 3 months earlier go back on a strike again, demanding more now. They realize the regime is in retreat, so go for more. And this leads eventually, by say end of summer of 78, to a total general strike. I mean, the Iranian workers at the time were probably 4.7 million, that sort of rough figure, between 4 and 5 million. Almost 4 million are on a strike now. It's almost total, general strike. And the general strike completely changes the situation. And included in this general strike is the oil workers. Oil workers is one of those industries which goes on a strike 3 times. Only 78 alone. And they become more or less undeclared leaders of the workers' movement. Strike committees develop everywhere. Every factory where there was a strike, there's naturally a strike committee now. And these strike committees are mostly at the time actually influenced by the mosques. They get their information from the mosques. Every other political organization is suppressed. The only place where you get information is to go to the mosque, and mosques became centers of actually organization of this protest movement, including even workers. Workers, when we met after the revolution, would say, yeah, we went to the mosque and got this, we used to go there, get, information on what to do next. All the instructions that sort of were being handed out to these protesters came from the mosques. So the mosque was actually not dominating the workers' movement too. And in fact, some of the strikes, including the oil workers' strikes, were behind the scene also financially supported by the bazaar. They realized this is a good tool to have against the Shah. So they were actually feeding the workers in order to continue the strikes. But anyway, these waves of strikes eventually led to what you could call a very sort of peculiar situation of dual power. In the sense, not in the sense of Soviet Union, but in the sense that there were neighborhood committees everywhere. These neighborhood committees more or less controlled many of the major cities. You know, the police and the SAVAK wouldn't dare to go to some of these neighborhoods because the fuel and food, distribution of fuel and food became so important during the general strike that, you know, these committees were actually serving a very sort of useful function in terms of the communities they were serving, and they could not be crushed. And these neighborhood committees, alongside the strike committees, are the two important things that developed in the course of the last 4 or 5 months before the insurrection. Sorry. I'm sorry, this is probably a lot more than, you know.
It's like a breathless kind of...
I just tried myself to stop somewhere to give you a chance.
Race through this build-up to the insurrection, and so was there some special moment or something special happened that turned this from this dual power situation to the collapse of the government and the return of Khomeini?
Yeah, basically it seems now, it's all documented, that a deal was struck between USA and the so-called Islamic Revolutionary Council, which was set up by Khomeini. It was a secret committee made up of, say, Bazargan, Khomeini himself, Beheshti, a number of people that you may have heard of their name, Rafsanjani. A group of politicians were incorporated in this committee. They reached a deal with USA that we are not against transfer of power to Bazargan's government, to Islamic government Bazar. They sent NATO generals to Iran to persuade the army to stay neutral, don't intervene in crushing the mass movement. They sent people to, you know, turn the SAVAK into sort of accepting this deal. And the army, you know, declared that we are neutral. SAVAK was not allowing, you know, very good relationship with the religious hierarchy, etc. So they persuaded the Shah to go out, to go abroad for a while. And they appointed Bakhtiyar as the sort of prime minister. Bakhtiyar is from the old Iranian National Front, which was a coalition of bourgeois nationalist opposition parties during the Mossadegh's period, before the 1953 coup. So these are our sort of bourgeois opposition to the Shah type of groups. He brought one of these, Bakhtiyar, and as prime minister to sort of prepare this transition period. And they asked Khomeini back. The deal was, in fact, Carter reveals the beans. After, if you read his memoirs, he says, yeah, they cheated us. It was supposed to be a sort of liberal Islamic government, Bazargan. But they took over. You know, the mullahs, the ayatollahs, that's basically his concept of how he was cheated. That the agreement was with a sort of more moderate Islamic government, but they went further. Anyway, during this time that Bakhtiyar was there and Khomeini came back, of course the revolution was now, nobody could stop it. You know, I mean, I myself at the time, say about 20 days before the insurrections, went to Tehran. I was a student at the time in London. And in the 20 days that I was there was daily clashes with the military, with the army surrounding the Tehran University, every day. I mean, and there were demonstrations, any neighborhood you would go in Tehran, there were demonstrations, Nobody could stop it. So the wave of the sort of mass protest and mass movement, obviously as soon as Khomeini came, got 10 times larger. So by this time, the Royal Guards, they have a barracks in north of Tehran, they were worried. And they didn't agree with this deal, because the deal wasn't that the Shah would go, monarchy would go. This was supposed to be still some solution to keep the monarchy there. The Royal Guard decided the barracks that are protecting the royal palaces in north of Tehran is huge barrack, and it was sort of one of the top units of the Iranian army. They decided to go and attack the Air Force barracks in south of Tehran, because this was where the Air Force technicians were stationed. And the technicians had gone on revolt. They were publishing, videos of themselves marching and saying, Khomeini is our leader, this type of thing. And you can imagine technicians, they are different from the rest of the army. These are the technicians repairing airplanes, helicopters, etc. And the Royal Guard decided this is the center of sedition and I have to suppress this. So on their own, without the approval of the chief of the armed forces, which had already agreed they stay neutral in the protest in the fight between the people and the Shah, without their permission, he started marching down to south of Tehran to get these Air Force barracks. And of course, as soon as people heard the news that such a thing is happening, the whole Tehran erupted, Everybody rushed to the air, basically, anyway. Despite the fact that people were standing with placards on every street corner saying, go back home, Khomeini has not yet ordered the insurrection. So religious leaders didn't want this insurrection to take place, because they knew they had made a deal above. So this is an incident which would, they would resolve at the top. But nobody could control this. The workers' committees, strike committees, the neighborhood committees, the activists in these two were probably the most active people in this period, in this night in Tehran. They basically stopped the army from marching all the way down, and even when it reached the barracks, they still resisted it, and it lasted until the Air Force technicians opened the arsenals of the barracks to the people. So people got armed. They say almost 300, probably 300, 400,000, small machine guns were distributed among Tehran population that night. And later on, when they defeated the Royal Guard, then they ransacked every police station, every known Savak safe house, any known center of the old regime was basically ran to the ground that same night. So by say 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, the regime had collapsed in Tehran. And the next day, the Revolutionary Islamic Council that I mentioned before, under Khomeini's leadership, appointed Bazargan as the prime minister to go and form a government. And 14 military committees, which now we know, they were set up a year before by the Islamic, under the nose of Savak, they took over power in Tehran. They said, they are in charge of, security in Tehran, and so Bazargan was appointed as prime minister.
Did they ask for the machine guns back?
No. They tried, but this was one of the fights that went on for a long time until they managed to suppress. No. the first night they said, people, please bring back your guns, so obviously nobody did.
So, moving on a little, and already coming to the dark, so going from this story of revolution, which you told us, to counter-revolution, let's talk about women workers, women's organisations. So first of all, what part did women play in this movement that you've talked about? Were they all wearing veils? You mentioned women socialists or communists going on demonstrations and wearing veils. And how significant was the order for women to wear the veil and other anti-feminist actions by the new government?
Women were, of course, very active even in the religious demonstrations. Even religious women were quite active in some of these demonstrations. So, sort of, I don't know, there is a slight sort of difference between sort of Islamic women in Iranian sort of condition than some of our neighbors. So they were quite active. There were women's groups, in many of the, even, as I said, Islamic demonstrations. And a lot of women students, women workers, we had who participated in all these protests. But nothing specifically as women's movement. They just joined in with the general movement. But after the revolution, after the insurrection, they did play a very significant role. Because if you remember, the insurrection took place in late February. Next was 8th of March. So everybody in Tehran, say, including us, the political groups, was thinking of how to celebrate 8th of March. How best to confront the religious, leadership than by organizing an 8th of March, celebration. So we all went for 8th of March celebration, and committees were set up, some, sectarian by various political groups, so that they organized their own, but there were some joint committees. We were involved in one of these joint committees. And we had in our head, that not to openly come and pose this as a demonstration against the religious leadership, but how to use this actually to push a point of, no hijab, no Islamic hijab, when, the situation wasn't all that favorable for us. Anyway, one of those godsends, 2 days later, 3 days later, Khomeini made this stupid speech in which he actually said there is compulsory hijab to come.
2 days
after the insurrection, 3-4 days after the insurrection.
And before the International Women's Day.
Before this International Women's Day, he made this speech, which although he didn't say it exactly, but what it meant was from now on, Islamic hijab is compulsory. They had already started forcing it in governmental buildings. For example, you couldn't enter any governmental building without wearing the Islamic hijab. But they couldn't enforce it in the cities or anywhere else. So Khomeini made this speech saying how important is Islamic hijab and how now that the nation has become an Islamic nation, you must respect and obey, basically. So that was really like, such a huge, because a lot of political groups were opposed to the, 8th of March celebration, because they just simply didn't want to confront Khomeini at the time. They were all coming up with all these excuses. This is not the most important issue. USA danger is the most important issue, or getting rid of the Shahs, remainder of the Shahs, you're wasting your time, this is not the big issue. So it's that sort of political atmosphere within the left, including the radical left. So not a lot of people support it on the left. But as soon as Khomeini made this speech, at least a lot of women were mobilized, even from these groups. The cadres of these political groups themselves, against their own leadership, were now really active in a lot of these committees to try to organize 8th of March celebration. And of course, 8th of March came about, and it was a huge demonstration. It went from Tehran University to a square called, now Revolution Square. It's quite a long distance, and back, and the Islamic sort of thugs were attacking all along the routes of this demonstration. But a lot of people from Tehran got mobilized, coming males, to defend the demonstration, and it went successfully all the way to the square and back. And next day, Khomeini retreated. This is the only time that Khomeini has actually backed down on something. He came and said, no, I never said hijab is compulsory. He denied that he had actually said, and from history how compulsory hijab has been. But anyway, this is, as far as I can remember, the only time he actually retreated. Then after that, the women movement, of course, continued. But it never went back to that level of activity, because the left was still opposed to it. And on their own, they couldn't really carry on much further. And it fell under the hand of the sort of ex-monarchists, or the sort of previous regime's people, who were now realizing this is a good issue to pick up. But the actual radical women's movement sort of was suppressed.
So I'm actually just going to ask you one more question, and that is to continue that theme about the consolidation of the power of the Islamists. So you've described how they pushed that women's movement back, but of course, as we know, they also pushed back the workers' movement. They pushed back this movement of the urban poor. We end up with a situation after 2 or 3 years where almost all forms of political activity are outlawed. Repressive action has started against the workers' movement, against the left. So talk about that. Talk about the counter-revolution, the pushing back of the revolution by this new regime, and how did they do that?
Well, a number of sort of, political moves and the good old, suppression. Firstly, they sort of used let me sort of go back a bit. Immediately after the insurrection, national minority movements became a major issue. Because most of the Iranian national minorities are along the borders of Iran. So the Arabs are connected to the Arab countries, the Baluchis are connected to Pakistan, the Turks are connected to Azerbaijan, Soviet Union and Turkey, the Kurds are, they have section in Iraq, section in Syria, section in Turkey. So it's all these national minorities along the borders started, obviously, a protest. And especially the Arabs and the Kurds became very significant, and they had to send the army to crush this. They managed to crush the Arabs quite rapidly, but they couldn't manage to crush the Kurds so rapidly. But this created this atmosphere that we are under foreign threat, that these are, Saudis and Saddam Hussein trying to do this, and this is the USA trying to, so all this political propaganda was beginning to justify the military adventures in these areas. And when they were defeated, in fact, I think that was, now that we go back to the documents and memories and histories, I think that was the main reason behind the US Embassy occupation. to divert attention from the defeats in Kurdistan, defeats in Turkmen Sahara, defeats, these military adventures all came to defeats, yeah? Except for the Arabs, which was not a major force and it was suppressed quite quickly. And then, they sort of diverted, we were having, daily shows in front of US Embassy. Workers would leave their factory, come and stand in front of US Embassy to listen to these diatribes from the students following Imam's line on how, USA, how we've defeated USA, how we've done this, how we've done that. So basically, the real anti-imperialist struggle in the factories was sort of diverted to this phony, theatrical anti-imperialist struggle in front of the US Embassy. Thirdly, they sort of tried to by this time, organize their own institutions. They had started building these, so they didn't have, they couldn't utilize the old government fully for their own purposes. So they were building this parallel organization, by which time, say 1980, 1981, these are major forces, especially given the fact that we are now in the middle of a war with Iraq. So the militarization of Iranian society and the rebuilding of the state structures and the state instruments of repression took place, and now we say Islamic tinge, took place in this period. So by the time we reach 82, 81, 82, you could say the actual revolution is defeated, is suppressed. And there's hardly any movement after that until recent, until few years. So by all means and purposes, you could say by 1981, at the latest by summer of 1982, they totally defeated the revolution, consolidated power, forced almost all opposition into exile, and unfortunately the left, who had, vacillated or supported Khomeini 2-3 years earlier, had now realized and made a mistake. Sections of the left now went into an adventurous line. Earlier they had sort of followed. Now that we are defeated, they became radical. They want, fight. So of course, this military adventure was actually used as an excuse to even suppress the revolution much deeper and much further. So basically by 83, it was all finished. So no political groups could remain active inside Iran, basically. We all went into exile. And this is, for example, I didn't came out because of that, but it coincided, at the time I came to attend the World Congress of the Force International, but, by the time I wanted to go back, it just couldn't. it had all finished.
That's a very somber place to which I'm going to stop asking questions, and I'm going to invite people here. So first